On today's video, if you are autistic or ADHD or on the neurodiversity spectrum, how to ask for an accommodation without actually asking for an accommodation. Hi, I'm Brett, the Audhd boss. I have a diagnosis of ADHD, autism, and anxiety, the AAA, and I have been a boss, a manager, a people manager in a corporate setting for more than 10 years. And what I do on this channel is I try to help other Audhd people who are in the corporate workforce figure out how to navigate the corporate world with neurodiversity. On today's video, I want to specifically talk about accommodations. This is a tricky one. This is really hard. There's a lot of us that are nervous about asking for accommodations at work. There's a lot of opportunities within asking for accommodations. For some people who are not able to get a formal diagnosis, it can be a little daunting, it can be a little tricky to get an accommodation if you don't have the paperwork from a doctor. When you initiate the process for an accommodation, there's a series of things that immediately happen. If you're going to HR, if you go to your manager, if you're doing anything and you're formally asking, they're going to set forth a series of paperwork and protocols, and for the most part, there are certain federal guidelines and rules that have to be met when getting an accommodation. But with most corporate jobs, they may have certain workflows and policies of things that they require you to do to get to that accommodation. In some instances, a lot of those requests, a lot of those things that they ask you to do kind of go against what you need for an accommodation to get the accommodation. Things like having very specific deadlines, certain things around paperwork, outlining very specific things that you need, disclosing things that you may or may not want to disclose. The key thing here is if you go down the path of asking for an accommodation, they will do what is called a reasonable accommodation. And the phrase reasonable is very key here, because a reasonable accommodation specifically means that it's not a huge ask from the organization to make this accommodation work for you. So the reasonable accommodation. So a reasonable accommodation is something like noise canceling headphones. A reasonable accommodation could be something like having very clear and explicit written instructions, very clear and explicit in any instructions, but specifically having written instructions. Having a quiet space to work out of, or being able to play music while you're working, or having some sort of distraction or something like that. So there's a lot of things that are covered in what is allowed and what is not supposed to be pushed back on in terms of accommodations. There's a lot of the government has listed a lot of these things. There's a lot of great organizations online that break down for autism and ADHD and other neurodivergent accommodations requests. I will link to some of those in the comments or in the descriptor. And those are definitely worth checking out, because there's a lot of really good details for what you can do for the accommodation process. Now, if you're self-diagnosed, or if you don't want to disclose your diagnosis, there are ways you can ask for an accommodation without formally asking for an accommodation, depending on your need and how quickly you need this. One of the things I might recommend first is, if you don't already, establish a formal check-in with your boss. It's really critical to, especially in a corporate world where there's maybe a lot of demands, a lot of to-dos, a lot of tasks, to have a formal check-in with your boss. A check-in can be 25 to 30 minutes, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. Although monthly ones tend to be a little trickier, you really want to try to strive for weekly or bi-weekly. And they can range from anywhere from 25 minutes to 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the type of work that you do or the type of schedules that you and your boss have. But check-ins are a really great opportunity to do two really important things. Establish a regular dialogue with your boss. That dialogue in that check-in should start to maybe take shape a little bit. A little bit of what is on your to-do list, what are things that you feel are your priorities, the things that you're working on week in and week out, and what your boss might feel are their priorities for you, or things that your boss wants you to be working on. For many of us, we can struggle with decision fatigue, demand avoidance, and prioritization. We might slip into a hyper focus for something that we really want to do, or we might just really just slip into a hyper-focus, even if it's not something we want, it's just something we're doing and we're there. A check-in can help manage a little bit of that to some degree, where if you have a lot of things and you're having decision fatigue, you can ask your boss to help you go through your to-do list and help figure out what you should be prioritizing. What are the things that your boss really needs to get done? What are some things that your department really needs to get done? And you've got like 5 things, you might weigh them all as equal value, but maybe your boss values one of those things a little bit more than something else. A prioritization conversation could really help. And if you're doing that as a regular check-in, that's really helpful. That dialogue opens a door. You checking in with your to-do list, your boss giving you the updates that you might need to know. It's also a great opportunity for you to ask questions. Traditionally, a check-in is that safe space where it's just you and your boss, and you can kind of ask questions. So I know there was a video out there, I certainly responded to a TikToker who was talking about how for some people with autism and ADHD, if you're asking too many questions, some people feel they're being perceived as being a problem because they're asking too many questions, when really we're just looking for context, or we're looking for more information around something. A check-in is sort of the perfect place to ask all of those questions. Some people like to go into a check-in with an agenda, some don't. I used to have a boss that required me to put an agenda together 24 hours before my check-in with them, and then that gave them time to figure out if they needed to bring anything to that meeting regarding the items in my agenda. Now, of course, certain things would come up outside of the agenda, and I would bring those in as well. So I would always bake that into my agenda. I would put something in, anonymous items or extra items or other. But that was a way to sort of manage both my ADHD and their ADHD. Now, once you have established that dialogue, and once you have established sort of the regular cadence of meeting and building that rapport, and frankly building some trust within a check-in conversation, that's when you can start to ask for more specific accommodations. I had an employee once ask me for noise-canceling headphones. They made the case for why they needed it, and to me that was more than reasonable. They did not come to me sharing any form of a diagnosis. They did not come to me with a medical reason in any way, shape, or form telling me why they needed noise-canceling headphones. They just said, hey, I'm working in an open workspace and I can't concentrate, and I need noise-canceling headphones so that I can do my work. And the noise-canceling headphones that they wanted were less than $50, I think, and we had a big enough budget. It was not a big deal at all for me to just make that purchase for them. So there might be times where your department might have money for something affordable, or you can get reimbursed in some cases. I know that won't work for everybody. I know not everybody has that same situation, but it is certainly worth looking into. If you can't get that reasonable accommodation, if you ask in that more gentle way and you can't get it, then you could explore looking for a formal accommodation. And I will just note, I've said this a couple of times now, noise-canceling headphones are on the list that the government has listed as a reasonable accommodation, formally or if you formally ask. Other things like, again, asking for written instructions, asking for clear verbal dialogue, and then a follow-up in written instructions. Another time to think about getting a formal accommodation is if you have any concerns, if your boss is maybe bringing up regular things with you that they perceive you're not doing, or you're struggling with, or they're giving you a really hard, not a hard time, but it's certainly something that's coming up regularly, like, hey, more of this or less of that, or maybe you've been late too often and you're always like 5 minutes late, or maybe you're personally struggling with something, but that's coming through in your work, but your boss doesn't know that you're struggling because of your ADHD or your autism. If you're concerned about disclosing, or you're nervous about sharing and you don't necessarily want to come out, you can try to have an informal conversation with them about finding your way to something. But if that is starting to become a problem where you're concerned that your job is in somewhat of risk, that's when you really do want to look into more of that formal accommodation. The quicker you can kind of get to that formal accommodation, it can kind of stop that process if you think there's any concern to your job in any way, shape, or form because your ADHD, your autism is causing you to have a particular problem, or you're struggling to get something done at work, that's when you really want those accommodations. If you're struggling to do your job, you really do want to ask for the formal accommodations. So I'm going to link to all the different resources that are out there for how you can look at accommodations, but I'm going to make a series of YouTube shorts and probably some shorter 1-minute videos walking through the different things that are on the accommodations list and talk through how you can ask for those accommodations informally without formally having to ask for an accommodation. So keep an eye out for that. If you have any questions about accommodations or how to have that conversation with your boss or how to establish any of these things, one of the things that you also may want to think about during the check-in, what you might prioritize might be very different from what your boss might be thinking about prioritizing for you. A check-in is also a really good time to have that dialogue, to have that conversation with them, certainly. So check-ins are great for establishing trust, having regular conversations about priorities, having decision fatigue dealt with, just establishing regular cadence with your boss to figure out if you're both on the same page about various things around your job. All of these things help, and the more you have a regular weekly or bi-weekly check-in, then when you have your annual review, nothing should be a surprise within your annual review, because hopefully you're having that dialogue, you're hopefully having that conversation during the check-ins throughout the year. And the closer that you're getting to those reviews or at the end of the year goal review setting conversation, again, you can be thinking about bringing those into your check-in. I like to bring a checklist into my check-in of things that I specifically need my manager to know about. I like to bring in a list of things that I'm working on, and I definitely look forward to, I also keep a list of questions that I want to ask my manager specifically within my check-in, since that's usually a safe space to sort of ask questions that I maybe need more context for, or I need more detail on, or I may not know the answer to something. That is the time and space that I usually use for that. I hope this information helps. This is the beginning of a long series, so obviously the theme for this particular video is establish a check-in and how to use that check-in to informally start a dialogue and build some trust so that you can start to informally ask for accommodations without formally asking for accommodations. But I'm going to start a YouTube series on just that, how to ask for accommodations without having to ask for accommodations. So keep an eye on that. Please subscribe to the channel, like and subscribe, and use the comments section so you can let me know if you have any questions about ADHD and autism in the workplace. If you have questions about accommodations, if you have questions about how to ask for something without it being a formal accommodation, please let me know. I would love to hear from your thoughts, your comments, and definitely keep an eye out for the YouTube shorts that I'll be producing around the series as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe. It definitely helps the channel and helps me grow and helps me help more people. Thanks for watching.